a number of places where we see that actually. So after the break, we'll go into the structure of the book. But just another little exercise here. Tell me, what do you see? How many of you see an older woman? Guys, look, okay, hold your hands up. Now look around. Guess what? There's different opinions out there, looks like. How many of you see a younger woman? Wow. Who's right? Who's right? You're both right. That's reality. But we look at things from a different perspective, right? And then we have to wrestle with it. Okay, what is the real trick here is we actually have to find out what is the painter of this picture, what was he trying to do? Exactly what we exercised to show two pictures with one picture. And that we look at things differently, and we see things differently, and it doesn't mean we're wrong. But very often we learn from one another in that effort. So when somebody sees a situation in the Old Testament very differently from you, that should be, wow, I want to get together with that guy because I could learn something. That's kind of what is depicted here. What do we see here? Who sees a vase? You see both. Many see both, yeah. And the other is the two faces. Again, there's two issues, but both are right. Who sees the trumpet playing? The man with the big nose and playing a trumpet. Who sees the young lady? Who doesn't see anything? Now watch, this same picture, let's just put a little more context around it. That's often what we do in Scripture. We read something, we don't quite see it. Well, let's look at the larger context. Let's look at the larger picture. Let's see if it makes a difference. I've just backed up a little bit. Does it make a difference? Is it more clear? A little bit, huh? Let me do another one. Is that more clear now? And it's the same thing. We want to read it, and we want to think. We don't just read the verse and we hang our hat on it. No, what's the context? What's the story about? What is he talking about? Who are the people he's talking to? What is the argument? What are they even talking about? So you want to ask those kind of questions and to come up with reality. Who sees a rabbit? Who sees a duck? Yeah, that's the most clear one, right? But there's actually the beak could be the ears. Yeah. So this is actually a good time to take a break. Let's be back in 10 minutes. Is that good? So according to that clock, a structure in their book. In fact, they have chapters, they have paragraphs, they structure it so to communicate. Well, the author of Genesis is no different. It looks different than how we do it, but nevertheless, he has structured his book very carefully. And it helps us to understand what, in fact, he is trying to communicate. For example, he has 11 times where he has used the term "in the generations of." And he did that very intentionally, seemingly, from our understanding, because he is trying to communicate something. It is a story, and it's a progressive story. It goes forward, on and on and on. And here are the verses in which you see that term. 2:4, it's the generations of the heavens and the earth. 5:1, we have, it's actually the book of the generations of Adam. Then we have Noah. We have the sons of Noah. Shem. We have Terah. We have Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, the sons of Esau, and Jacob. And I'm assuming the book of Exodus is regarding the sons of Jacob, even though they start in Genesis already. But very, very carefully structured. There's a progression, and these are in perfect order in which they happen to be. And later on, I think it's later on, maybe I'll do it now even, I don't know for sure. I'll touch on it now, and then we'll cap on it again later on. But in Genesis 1:1, when he says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and void." Very difficult to understand. Would you agree, or am I the only one? It's very difficult to understand. And there is actually not multiple, but at least two major opinions on how that is structured. In fact, many will say it is the caption of what he's about to talk about. Meaning, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then starting in verse 3, this is how he did it. Boom, 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 boom. Right? If that is the case, then it unlocks a whole new reality for us. Why? Because the ancient world, the number 12 was very important. That would mean this author has 12 prologues in the book, not 11. And many will say, boy, that makes a lot of sense in that culture. What is so significant about the number 12? And Jared, you're free to help me here. We actually, in Sumeria, in the Sumer culture, that is known as the very first culture of the world, after the ark, I should say, right? Yes. Yep. And we to this day operate on their technology. Have you ever thought, why do we have 12 hours in our clock? We have 24 in a day, but why do we have 12 and 12? Why do we have 60 seconds in a minute? Who dreamt that up? Why do we have 60 minutes in an hour? Who dreamt that up? The ancient culture. How did they do that? Because they thought 12 must be the mathematical formula how the world functions. We tend to think in tens, right? In the decimal system, everything's in tens, da-da-da-da-da. And tens is good. It actually has a very close relationship with 12. But tens are easy to multiply. 10 times 100, on and on and on. Very easy. Division, however, is not. 12 is good for division. You go to a store and I'll buy a third dozen eggs. Well, if the dozen or the cartridge has 10, you're in trouble. But if it has 12, it's nicely divided, right? This is how they did it. They would take one hand and they would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's 12 joints in your fingers. And this is the counter. And that would be 1. Then we do it again. And that would be 2. After 5 times, guess what we get? We get 60. That is the history of our minutes and our seconds. And in fact, today, many will say the 12 actually is much easier to function with when you look at the overall than the number 10. Because it allows you to divide as well as multiply. Much easier. But that's where we got it from. And we still function at it today. "12 phases of the moon." Yep. Completeness. Yep. Yeah. And it's usually implies the whole. This is the whole picture. And interestingly enough, we have 12 tribes of Israel. Why would God choose that? That's what his people understood. Why would Jesus have chosen 12 disciples? Is it just a random number? No, he's saying they represent the whole. Why does John in Revelations talk about the 144,000? Is there 144,000 and that's it? No. It's symbolic of the whole picture. It's in fact 12 times 12. It's the bigger picture. It's the completeness, absolute completeness. And they would have understood that concept in that culture. Unfortunately, we have to learn it to understand it because we have to get into their shoes. Right? So, very interesting stuff, very good stuff, in fact. It helps us to understand why the 12, 12, 12, which we see repeatedly. And we also have the 40 years and 40 years. Well, Jeremiah touch on that. I don't know if he will or not, but we're in Genesis. So what time period are we dealing with? And Jared will do some timeline on the Exodus. There's an argument in the Exodus, but he'll do the time frame on that and how they discovered that. But in Genesis, we actually have great indicators of what time period the author is dealing with. Joseph was sold for 20 shekels. We know that, right? Hands down. He as a slave. Well, they discovered in the Mari tablets, which is something like this. If this is Israel, Jerusalem would be in this ballpark. Mari is way up in here, Syria. But they've actually uncovered tablets, and they discovered that Mari was the capital city of northern Syria, of the Amorites, and it dated from 2000 to 1760 BC. So we know the Exodus roughly 1446, so it gives you a framework. This is prior to it. And they discovered, that was discovered in 1933, some 15,000 tablets, that a slave was sold in that time period for 20 shekels. Okay, that's helpful. The Hammurabi Code, which dates back to 1754 BC, that was a Babylonian being down here somewhere, region. The Babylonian law, they also indicated a slave was sold for 20 shekels. Now that's 1754. So we're right in the ballpark of this time period, right? In the third dynasty of Ur, which dates even further back, and Ur, we remember, is where Abram came from, right? Roughly 2113 to 2006 BC, so long before then, a slave was sold for 10 shekels. Okay? By 1400 BC, 14 to 1300 BC, the price was 30 shekels. I should do this. Slave was, but it was 30 shekels. In the Syrian market by 800 BC, they were sold for 50 to 60 shekels. And then by the Persian period, it was 90 to 120. You see the progression going up. So we can easily exclude a lot of time period when Joseph was sold for 20 shekels. We have a good framework of what time period we're dealing with, right? And I was going to do this, but I chatted with Jared, and he's going to do a little more on how we get certain time periods. I'll just say this one thing, because Jared, I don't think he will be doing this one. The heavens and the earth, the sun, the moon, and the stars, the night and day was created for what? Time. For us to tell time. That's why we have astrologers, and they very often, when they discovered the time of the birth of the Messiah, it was through astrology. The wise men from the east, right? They came, and it is very accurate. In Assyria, way back in the time period about 910 to 612 BC, in that time period, they have discovered lists of the kings, and they would mark down all their key events in their time and their reign time. And one of those events was what's it called? When the sun goes behind the moon, eclipse. Was an eclipse. So astrologers could date that back perfectly to June 15, 16, 763 BC. And then we take records where various Assyrian kings have interacted with Israeli kings, and we can deduce the numbers to where, okay, this time period is where he must have reigned, so and so on. And the picture you see on the board here is one of those, is where King Jehu is paying homage or tribute to the Assyrian king. And that's Jehu bowing to his knees. And he was the king of the northern kingdom, northern Israel, after the separation. And he's paying homage and tribute to the king of Syria. But and we see those connections, and that monument is actually dated back to 841 BC, and it is actually in the British Museum today. You can actually go see it. But we have connections, and they've just worked at it with the artifacts that they found, and we can be very specific in our dating. And it's good, it's awesome, and it really helps us to understand. So let's see who wrote Genesis. That is important because we need to know what is this individual's background. How did he think? Some scholars will say, well, it's a compilation of authors. Why? Because there's various names used for God in the book. There's Elohim, there is Yahweh, Um, and then there's the period of the Deuteronomists. He likely wrote Deuteronomy. And then there's the framework of the Leviticus, likely a priestly author. So they go, well, all these guys, they had their writing, and then somehow it just all maneuvered in place to where this guy wrote this guy wrote this, but actually this guy wrote it here, but it actually belongs here, and that's fabricating something. So, and it's called the JEDP theory. When you see it, dismiss it. That's my opinion. But you're free to look at it and see how they thought. I think it's way out there. And it is becoming more and more a non-issue. No, it was not. In fact, one of our teachers in YWAM, he did this whole lecture on hills to die on. What are some of the issues that we say, no, I will die on this hill, meaning I will fight for this truth because I believe it. One would be Jesus coming in the flesh, hands down, right? We don't argue with that. If you don't believe it, you're not a believer. I will pray for you. I will testify to that reality. What's one of the hills we die on. He says, interestingly enough, Moses, being the author of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the gospel or of the scriptures, is a hill worth dying on. And then he went on to explain. He gave university after university after university that they started there, but when that changed, when that concept changed to Moses is probably not, or maybe not wholly, or there was multiple authors, when that changed, the outcome of that university was away from the scriptures, away from Christianity. And it was like, wow, our thought process has huge ramifications, even though we may not be experience it immediately, but following that track, it's like being the 1 degree off. You're very close, but eventually you fall off the rails. But it's something, it's out there, and probably worth reading up on it. This is how it was, but and make your own opinion on it. One of the arguments is, well, Genesis was borrowed. There is multiple ancient cultures out there, and they all have a creation story. They all have a flood story. They all have various stories that are very comparable with the scriptures. So they go, well, likely the author of Genesis just copied it from some other cultures. Well, again, our archaeologists have done a wonderful job to show us that is not possible or very unlikely. After digging up clay tablets in 1975, some 17,000 clay tablets were found in Syria, and about 600 years later, the story in I should learn to read my notes. So in 1975, 17,000 clay tablets predating the Babylonians. An account 600 years after documents found in Elba, which is in northern Syria. Each have their own story of creation story. The one in Elba is much closer to the Genesis, time-wise, much closer to the Genesis story, and therefore is much closer to exactly what Moses wrote. The theory that has been proven over and over again, usually the simplest story is the initial one. And as it grows from there, we have these degrees off, it gets more and more embellished. Because they keep adding stuff to it, and it becomes a completely different story. But the closer one is likely the simpler one. And it shows again even in our archaeology. The further they get away from time-wise from the time of Moses writing, the worse they get. No, 1975 is when the clay tablets were found. 80. Yep, yep. But we have the gospel writers, Mark 10:3, Luke 24:7, John 1:17. They all attribute the Pentateuch to Moses. And I will not argue with the New Testament. And not only that, Jewish fathers, through the church ages, it has always been Moses. It has only been in the latter years where they have, well, this JEDP theory has crept up. And there are people out there wanting to disqualify the scriptures, and they find reasons to disqualify it. So we have to be aware of it, and we have to, still have to engage with them. If they got papers out there and they got all this publication in the international community, then we have to engage with it. We have to at least either argue against it or show their error or something, right? We can't just ignore it and say, let it be what it is. So the geographical setting of Genesis. And if you look at the paper I handed out there, that is what we call a horizontal, and it just means a horizontal picture of a book. And you can do that for every single book in the Bible. And it's really just reading, and finding obvious breaks. Did the author move from, let's say Paul, for example, he moves from theology and then application. You know, there's a distinct break that he makes. In the case of Genesis, we have 4 stories, right? And we have 4 people that he's focusing on. And that horizontal, that I did that. There's many views out there, but that is actually in it is the right proportion. What you see there, least amount of the text is devoted to the 4 stories. Most of the text is devoted to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph in chapter 37 forward. So just looking at that at face level, what do you think the author would be trying to communicate, or what is the author focusing on for his readers? Is it Genesis 1? Is it the flood? What do you think he's focusing on? The patriarchs. And why would that be important? Later we'll also uncover who he's writing to, and this is actually a huge part of it. Why would he write this about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to the Babylonians? It means nothing to them. He writes it to a people who understand who they are. These are your fathers. And we can by deducing that fact, if I write to LaDawn, I will write about things she understands. And it may mean nothing to anybody else. Moses is writing to a specific people. He's not just writing and throwing it out there and see what happens. No, he's writing to a specific people and for a specific reason. And we can see it when he addresses Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And later, the book of Genesis starts where, or Exodus starts where Genesis leaves off. Very intentional, very intentional. And you see chapters 1 through 11, we are in Mesopotamia. We are way up in here somewhere. And then by the time we are at the end of Genesis, we're in Egypt. or so we have a progression moving down throughout the whole book. And now we'll talk about the ancient Near East. Ancient Near East is a simple term discovered at the period of the Ottoman Empire, I think. It looks like this. But we also have the Middle East. Now we're talking about something that we all understand. We have the Middle East. And then we have the Far East. All of those terms you understand. And it's simply in relation to Europe. And these kind of terms were developed, I think, in, any idea, Jer? No. I think it was around late 1800s, 1900s in there. But it's just a framework. So the ancient Near East is the nearest land mass to Europe. The Middle East is next, and then the Far East, Russia, Japan, and all that. So that's all it is. And it's a term that is used everywhere. So when I talk about the ancient Near East, it has no specific meaning other than it identifies which region of land we're talking about. But let's talk about their historical background. How did the ancients think? And again, we have tons of evidence on how they thought, which is only discovered since 1850. So we actually know more than Luther, Calvin, Augustine. We know a lot more. They didn't have this. And that's okay, because as we are a work in progress, so is our understanding. We grow in knowledge, right? And we do what we have with what we have. But in the ancient Near Eastern world, there is no such word as religion. Doesn't exist. If you would talk about what religion are you, it's like, what does that mean? They did not have that. There's no difference between the natural and the supernatural. We can often speak of divine intervention. This and this happened. God must have divinely intervened here. And we understand what that means. That meant nothing to them, because everything was run by the gods. Plural. That's how they thought. The gods did everything. The sun came up, there was a god moving it up. The moon, stars, everything. The whole universe was run by the gods, and there were many of them. We think in a linear path. We are born, we move forward, and we stand here like this. I'll give him a nose so you know which direction he's facing. But this is the future, and it's kind of cloudy and in a mist. We really don't know what the future holds. We have dreams, we have hopes, and we're moving toward it. But reality, it's kind of obscure, right? The past, well, that's behind us. It's ancient. We're moving on to new things. It's different. That is how we function, and it's easily to communicate. The ancients did not. The ancients, they saw themselves in a field where the future and the past merged. That's where everything came together. And in this field, they were oriented to their past, not their future. And it even shows up in their very language. For example, north is the same word for left. Right is the same word for south. The back or behind you is the same word for west. So which way do you think they were oriented? East. What's in the east? Yes, that's where they came from. They were the ancients. Those are their roots. Where does Abram send Jacob to? Back east to go find a wife. And Isaac served the servant to go get Isaac a wife as well. So that's how they were oriented. And they believed that in this, the future was mystical, the same as ours in that regard. But they got their direction from their history. They knew where they went by what did our fathers do. That's how we learn how to do it. It's not searching for new ideas, but looking back to what has been done. That's how we do it. And as a result, reality changed very, very, very slowly. In fact, it was Galileo, I think, was one of the first ones who said the Earth was actually moving around the sun. And it was a big deal because the church always taught otherwise. And now the church would be stood up for false teaching or something. It was a big deal. But scientific, we know that's true. And it doesn't negate our text in any way, shape, or form. Their geography looked something like this. You have all the blue circle, that's all called the primeval waters, or what is known as chaos. In fact, all the oceans, as far as they're concerned, did not support life because they couldn't drink the water and live. They would die. So it was chaotic waters. That's where the monsters live and all this and that. So when God comes in Genesis 3, I think it is, or 4, where he separates the waters from the waters, that's exactly what it means. He put his hand in there and he separated. He made a space in the middle of the waters for them to function and for life to be sustained. That's exactly how they viewed it. We have all the outside waters. That was all chaotic waters. And you can see why the windows of heaven were so important. Because when it rained, where'd the water come from? God must have opened the windows. And we have I'll just read some text. Psalms 29:10 says, "The Lord sits enthroned over the flood." Does that make more sense now than it did prior? It makes a lot more sense. Job 38:2, he walks on the vault of heaven. Psalms 104:2, stretching out the heavens like a tent. You see that little opening part where the cloud is in the middle there? That is the heavens. So when we say God is in heaven, the ancients would have disagreed with us very strongly. No, the gods are above the heavens. They're not in heaven. They're above the heavens. And he stretched it out like a tent. That half circle there, that dark circle you see, that was a solid canopy as far as they're concerned, because it kept the chaotic waters at bay. They couldn't flood them again. And yet, you can see why the ancients they felt this threat. They were compelled to serve their gods, because it was the gods who gave them life and kept the waters at bay. So they must serve them. They fed them, on and on and on. That was very much going on in the culture. Psalms 104:3, he lays the beams of his chambers on the waters, talking about God. They're above the waters. Psalms 42:2, earth founded on the sea. How does that make sense? Because the waters were all around. Job 9:6 and 7, who shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble. See those knobs down below there? Those were the pillars that helped sustain, give the stability in the water. The mountains on the edges were the, they don't show them very well, but they saw mountains on the edges that kept the solid dome in place. And interestingly enough, nowhere in scriptures do our authors seek to correct that. Guys, actually, it's not. The earth is actually a round ball. It's not a disc in this place. And the heavens there's no solid space. There's no windows. They don't seek to correct that at all. Why? It's not important. It's simply not important. That is their culture. That's how they viewed life. And if how should I put this? If we would change everything every time we learn something new in science, we would be in a perpetual state of change. Because tomorrow's science will look different than today's science. That's reality. Because it's a progressive thing. We learn as we go. But that is not what the authors are trying to correct, their cosmic worldview. What they're trying to correct is who, not what. Who is this God? Who is above the waters? In Egyptian literature, again, Moses was trained in Egypt. He was never in Israel. Pardon me, he may have gone there when he went to Midian. He may have crossed through, I don't know. But he was an Egyptian through and through, and he was trained in Egypt. In their literature, the Creator God came out of the primeval waters. Okay, now we have a discrepancy here. Their primary God came out of the water, where the text that Moses is writing, he is over and above the waters. Again, he's making the point. Your God, he may have come out of the waters, but he is not the sovereign. He is not the one we're talking about. There is a God above the waters. The ritual of Amun, which was the Egyptian god, was when no god had come into being and no man had been invented for anything, Amun came out of the waters. In the ancient world, something came into existence when it was separated out and given a distinct name and a function. Now it is something. Until then, it is nothing. It doesn't exist. The way that creation was expressed was by the mouth, which produced the name of everything. And in Exodus 19:5 and 6, Israel is being separated out of Egypt, given a function. You are a kingdom of priests. And in this way, Yahweh caused them to exist. In fact, Israel is created just like the heavens and the earth were created, using the same terminology. And that takes a bit to get our heads around what does that mean? In fact, Israel is created from Jacob. That's what the scripture says. And we come into a little bit of a fog. We need to wrestle with their understanding and say, what does that mean? How should we understand it? The gods existed through their functions and images in the temples. So, let's say one king would go and conquer another nation. The first thing he would do is destroy the temple of the nation he just conquered. And then when he would build his temple there to his God, and he would put an image in the temple. Because that image, now, that is how we connect to the gods, through that image, and he's the one now reigning over this land. That is how they thought. And the temple was the place where heaven and earth met. That's where man got to communicate with the gods. All cultures of the ancient world were polytheistic. There were many gods, including Israel. Although at the core of their stories, it appears like it was monotheistic, because there was always the first god who came out, and then other gods were born. So we have to put it all together and go, I wonder if their story started with the same story that Moses is writing, and it got embellished as the years went on a different track altogether. There seems to be a lot of parallels in their thinking. And Moses is again bringing Israel back to reality. All the gods were addressed as ruler of heaven and earth. They all carry that title. Gods were like humans, only stronger, and they lived longer. So again, it's a very visual perception. A strong individual had more authority because he could rule physically over another. And the gods were even above that. They must have been the strongest and the largest and living longer. Very, very practical thinking. The gods were not unjust in their minds. They simply didn't communicate what they expected. That's all. And here Moses is writing to Israel, giving them a great picture of who their God is, and then later even giving them the law. This is what I expect. Very foreign to the cultures around them. Their gods never did that. They did not communicate in that way. Their gods were not described as good or evil, for there was no standard with which to measure. We have a standard. We have the scriptures. We have, in our faith, we have standards. There was no standard. In fact, what was good and evil was relative to the community. What is good for us? That must be good. What is bad for us must be bad. And unfortunately, as humans, we all fall into that trap. Just because someone has passed on and I'm grieving, that must be bad. Is it? Is it bad? It's hard. It's difficult. It's grievous. Is it bad? In fact, who commanded that you must? That we must. That I must. See, we need to change our thinking according to God's bigger picture. In fact, the very thing that is grievous to us is our salvation. Our salvation is not complete until we have shed the old and put on the new. We have begun in Christ. We're in process, but we're being changed, right? And far be it from me to say it's okay. No, it's always sad. It's always because we're human. But we don't mourn like those who have no hope, right? We see beyond. And that's why, we understand. We have a bigger picture. We understand who Yahweh is. We understand who our Creator is. It's okay. No, we must. In fact, the Greeks thought this way. The worst thing that could ever happen, in fact, their second death, what they termed as the second death, was to never be able to die. That would certainly be a second death, to be trapped in this body. That's how they thought. So it's again just a small picture of how we are the product of change. And that's why we do study. That's why we study the scriptures, to allow it to generate within us what is really meant to be and what is truth. Right? In creation, we always think from nothing to something, right? That's not how the ancients thought. The ancients thought from chaos, where there is nothing, couldn't sustain life, to a life-sustaining ability. So from chaos to cosmos, from chaos to an ordered world. That's how they thought. To describe creation is to describe the establishment of a functioning cosmos, something that actually works. We build tables. We create tables. We actually think in the very same terms in many ways if we let ourselves go there. This used to be just a pile of rubble, right? And man created a table. Now it has a name and it has a function. It is something. Before it was nothing. In Egypt, an Amun, the first of the gods, he existed before anything, yet he emerged out of the primeval waters. Egyptian cosmology starts with non-existence. There was nothing. That nothing was made up of darkness and water. Again, it's worth our while to consider how they thought. And is it actually how we understand the text, or should we, you know what I'm saying? It's worth considering. Sumerian texts, heaven and earth, darkness and water. Nothing was differentiated and had no function. That is how non-existence started. And we're almost done, and I was hoping to get into the text, but I warned you ahead of time. But it's very good. It's preparation for engaging with the text on a whole new perspective, and just allowing to marinate a little bit. We have two primary views in Genesis 1 that is being debated and discussed extensively, and that is ex nihilo, which means God spoke it and boom, there it was. There was nothing, not even air, there was nothing. He spoke it into existence. And the other aspect is creating was bringing order to what already existed. And he made it to function to sustain life, to allow it to sustain life. Bringing order out of chaos is the imagery of a potter or a potter working on clay. He takes a lump of clay and he shapes it and he molds it into something. He creates something. That's the imagery of the ordering event. And we see that in Genesis 2:7. We see that in Isaiah 29:16. Various other passages. We see that perception. Or often it is as it pertains to the conflict between the gods and Yahweh, the one God, Israel's God. And the opposition that is rising there. We see that in Job. We see that in quite a few passages in Job. We see it in Psalm 74, Isaiah 27. The idea of multiple gods is very, very common in our biblical texts. We tend to think all of that is a no-go, and there's only one God. And I agree, there is only one God. But we cannot jump into our 21st century and read the text, and even we must wrestle with the fact on how they thought, because we'll lose the message if we don't. And we'll be inserting our 21st century ideas, and actually we cannot do that, because now we're guessing, we're hoping, we're fabricating, and we could be right, but we may also be wrong. And it's just not safe to do that. The best practice is, to the best of our ability, understand the text from the ancients' perspective and then work from there. What is the author trying to communicate to their readers, and how should we, therefore, because of it, understand it? So let's talk about Genesis chapter 1:1, and then we've started into the text, and then tomorrow we'll go forward from there. Is that a good idea? Maybe there's somebody is wrestling with something and would love to have something clarified, a question. Is there anyone like that? Yeah. Yeah, when something ceased to function, it no longer had purpose, that God must be dead. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. No, very literal thinking in that way. Yep. Any other questions? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Terrible. Absolutely terrible. Yeah. And you'll see in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 how very different Yahweh functions opposed to their gods. And that's the message the author is trying to bring to Israel. Israel is coming out of Egypt at this point, and we haven't even talked about the original reader. But here's a clue. Israel. They've been called out of Egypt, and Moses is writing. If Moses is writing, we already have a time frame as to when he wrote, right? Must have been in this 120 years or whatever it was that he lived, right? Where was I going? I lost my train of thought. Yes. He's communicating. He's introducing Israel to their God. They have lost it. They are worshiping the gods of Egypt. And how do we know? Well, they came across the waters, and what's the first thing they do? They complain to Moses, and they start making their gods again and bowing down to them. And very specific gods. And they have actually found the stone. They believe it's the stone with the Egyptian gods drawn on there in Saudi Arabia. That's a whole another week of teaching there. But again, he's introducing them to their God, who is Yahweh. And that's the question that he seeks to answer to his people in the book of Genesis. It is not a random history. It is very specific, introducing Yahweh, the God, the Creator God, the one who chose Abraham, who caused Isaac to be born of a promise, who caused Jacob, on and on and on. Very specific. And the whole story is, this is your God. This is your master. And he's the one who brought you through the waters. Very specific. So let's talk about Genesis 1:1. We're a little bit over time. Are you okay with about 10 minutes? Yes? Okay. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And that is an awesome translation. But there are actually other views on that. And again, I'll just lay it out on the table and let's talk about it. The word in the beginning is Bereshit. And I'll write it on here so I can explain how it is written and what that entails. And here we want to remember, I think I mentioned it, the Masoretes, which were from about 600 to 1000 in that ballpark, what they did with the Hebrew Scriptures. Up until that point in church history, more and more, we have a problem in the New Testament, first of all, where the Hebrews or the Jews and the Christians both claim the same text as their text. That was a problem. And they didn't like each other. The Jews hated the Christians, as we see with all the martyrs of the apostles. So by 600 or so AD, the Jewish scholars and scribes, they took it upon themselves because to put vowels in the written language. The Hebrew text, the ancient, had no vowels at all. It was memorized and it was understood through teaching what this is. So they decided, they felt that their scriptures was being robbed. So they decided we have to put vowels on it to ensure proper pronunciation of all our words. So this is what Bereshit would have looked like before that. That's what it would have looked like. And that could mean multiple things. They were concerned this was going to be misused. So they put vowels in all their alphabets, and the vowels cause proper pronunciation. Proper pronunciation meant proper understanding. So in this case, they would add this. Actually, I'll use a different color so you can see the vowels specifically. They added those dots in there. And that clearly says Bereshit. That's what it says. You know? And this could also, this same word, I'll write it again here because it's significant. And you read from right to left, not the other way. From here to there. Left to right. I think I'm right. Now, if this was written like this, that means something quite different. This says, in the beginning, and this says, in beginning. The definite article is missing in here. This could be, it's very difficult to translate actually. But it could be when he began, at the time he began, something of that nature. But this one is clear, in the beginning, hands down. What do you think we're reading in Genesis 1:1? How is it written? Let's just for fun, let's do a vote. Would you say in the beginning? Most all, yep. And that's what our translation says, right? Guess which one is the correct one? Not a beginning? No. This is the definite article. This does not have the definite article. This is how it's written. Literally in beginning, but it's grammatically, it's difficult to translate. I think that's why they chose in the beginning, because it just flows better. But understanding is different. Wait a minute. We're not talking about before there was nothing? Okay, let me make it very clear. Do I believe God created everything ex nihilo, out of nothing? Yes, I do. According to our text, though, we don't get that from Genesis 1:1. We get that from Colossians 1:16, and we get that from John 1:3. So the concept, and the authors may have very well, our translators may very well have said, well, in the bigger picture, we know from the New Testament that's actually what happened, and therefore we're okay to translate it that way. And I agree. It is what it is. I don't think it will have any bearing on our salvation, for that matter. But we have to treat the text for what it is, right? In fact, the Jewish Bible Society, they translate their English text with when God began. That's how they translate it. And that's very accurate, actually, to how the Hebrew text is written. So does it matter to us? Well, maybe it does. Because if we're looking at, if we're looking at the absolute beginning of anything, we're looking at maybe what, 10,000 years max from our text, right? So many have argued, no, it's millions of years, billions of years. Well, they actually have some precedence for it. Because what do we see in Genesis 1:1? If we translate when, then that whole first verse becomes a dependent clause grammatically, meaning it's not finished. There's more to the story. It's waiting like. It's like I went and studied at the library. Or no, when I studied at the library. It's like, okay, then what, right? That's the idea that we have in Genesis 1:1. God created the heavens and the earth. Or when God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. Now we put the second verse with it. It makes perfect sense. And in that case, if that is correct, then Genesis 1:3 is the first act of creation. And God said, let there be light. Why do I bring this up? Just to say there's various views in there, and they could actually go to the text and say, well, this seems correct to me. Should we argue over a timeline or a time, millions of years versus 10,000 years? Is that what the author wants us to know? Not at all. Now we're asking of the text what the author has never attempted to answer. And then what is the result? He goes in his camp and I go in my camp. And we pout. And we know what happens when we grumble. It's not comprehensible, right? We have such a small time frame, right? And again, it's just our due diligence in studying the text and let it be what it is and adjust our thinking. Am I saying in the beginning is actually a wrong translation? I don't think so. It's very difficult to translate that. It takes a nuance of some form, but that seems to be smooth. But I think it has misled us in how to think of what beginning are we talking about? Before there was nothing, or when God came and he started to bring order to what already was there. So now you have something to scrape your head with overnight in dreams if you want. And then tomorrow we'll just go into Genesis 1:1 or the text, and we'll uncover. And again, I will be giving multiple opinions and views on it, and then we have to just wrestle with, okay, where do I land? And it's not right or wrong. It could be different, but it just is what it is, right? And we have to wrestle with it. So let me pray, and then we will be dismissed. Father, you are our merciful God, and we are grateful for your texts that you have given us that we can learn and study, Father, and we come humbly before you, and we ask, will you continue to reveal truth to us as we engage with you, as we engage in your text with one another, and Lord, that we learn to grow together in humility, always in humility. We praise your name, Jesus, and we trust you in everything, with our lives, with our everything. Will you go with each one of us, Lord, tonight? And thank you. Thank you for each one here, Father, for hearts that we together, Lord, we want to learn from you. We want to hear from you. We want to submit ourselves to you. That your work in us will continue, that we will be transformed and moved from a kingdom of darkness to a kingdom of light. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.